We kind of have the first polling that shows us how people are feeling. And I thought some of the numbers were quite interesting. Let me start with right track, wrong track for the country. In the NBC News poll, they looked at November of 2024, and only 27% of Americans thought the country was on the right track. Fairly close election, even though, close in the states, not that close in the Electoral College. And this recent poll shows that in March of 2025, just a few months later, people are feeling pretty good. And the right track, wrong track is now 44% of people think the country is on the right track. That's quite an increase. And as a Democrat pointed out to me today, he's like, but that's not everyone. I'm like, yes, but you have to admit it is better. And Republicans are looking at President Trump that has his highest approval rating that he's ever had. And the country is giving him some time to work through the things that he said that he wanted to do. Is that right? Yeah. Is that right?
I think that's a pretty decent take. Like, the trajectory's pretty good for people's assessment. Now, the trajectory's good partly because the bar was extremely low with Biden, right? Mm-hmm. The bar became, is there a functioning president? So I think to the extent that Trump is getting quite a bit of leeway, some of it is from that. And it is from the fact that people see an energetic leader, right? He's out there talking all the time. And as a contrast to Biden, I think people are very happy to tolerate a lot of his energetic intentions for a while because they were given the example of an executive who they didn't know what he was doing and was behind closed doors all the time, not really answering to anyone. So I think that's like, I call this the Democrats' baseline problem. Like, they have to admit where they were and what they were offering, like, before you can assess how people are assessing Trump. The other part is, I think elite media and people in this town get it wrong about the baseline problem. They don't understand why people find Trump appealing. They don't understand why people find federal bureaucrats unsympathetic. Mm-hmm. They don't understand why people feel like the government was out of control before Trump. So they don't assess properly how normal people assess Trump. That's always been an issue, but I think it continues to build.
Just to compare and contrast Trump's good numbers with the Democrats' like almost record low numbers at 21% approval, 27% approval. Like, it's really, really bad. But one of the things that was very visible very quickly was how President Trump was able to get control of the border, which was tied as the number one issue in the election. It was the economy and immigration. And in 50 days, they were able to shut the border down. And it really makes me think back to how many Democrats said, well, we couldn't do anything because the Congress didn't pass a law. And President Trump has shown that is not true, which is why today we are looking at a plane load of what the Trump administration said were Train de Aragua and MS-13 gang members who were here in the country illegally that had criminal records, and they were deported to El Salvador. There was a judge that said, wait a second, turn that plane around. The administration said no. Much more to come on that front. But I think if the left believes that Americans are going to be upset, like strongly upset, that the Trump administration got a plane load of criminal illegal aliens, gang members out of the country, they're going to be wrong again.
Yeah, I think even in these liberal cities, Democrats are on the wrong side of this issue from their voters in those cities. There's a place like, I mean, you're familiar with Denver. Yeah. Denver has spent tens of millions of dollars, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars. At one point, it was like 10% of the municipal budget of Denver was going toward illegal immigrants and to house them and to feed them and get all these things.
I remember when they had to shut down the pickleball courts because there wasn't enough money.
Well, and that's
Denver
what happened.
wasn't happy.
They were taking rec center money for citizens and turning it over to non-citizens. When you have that kind of dynamic and you add safety problems for people's neighborhoods on top of it, and the fact that many of these cities will not cooperate with deporting even violent criminal aliens, you're not even winning over liberals at that point. Mm-hmm. Many liberals are like, ooh, this is not good at all. So I think, yes, Donald Trump has a masterful way of making people go to bat for things they should not go to bat for. And Democrats will take him up on it on criminal illegal aliens, it seems. And I think he's won massive victories that are widely popular on this issue, partly because his acting so quickly highlighted that Biden did not act and that he absolutely could have.
And what do you hear? I always love to ask you about the moms because she is a mom of 4 beautiful children. How's the potty training going, by the way?
Oh my gosh. Well, the little one just showed up the older one this morning, so maybe she'll get her act together.
Okay.
He was like,
Breaking
I can
news.
do it.
He can do it. But what do you hear from moms on the inflation, immigration?
Right.
I don't know if people get too in the weeds on tariffs, but how much room does President Trump have on the economy with those folks?
Yeah. I think, look, there's less room on the economy. Like, I think he already won on immigration, basically. Like, people checked that box in their minds. And this is why I think you and I have talked about this. This is why I think the media has been focusing on DOJ, because they saw that people weren't reacting to immigration news and to the weepy, sad stories that they wanted to tell. So they moved on to someone else, federal bureaucracy. I do think when it comes to tariffs, maybe people aren't in the weeds, but they do get the sense that, like, oh, is this going to work out for my family and me? Is this a plan? Is this something that's going to cost me more money? Those questions linger. And I think because that was his, number 2 promise, or right up there with immigration, was cost of living issues. If that doesn't shake out in mom's favor, many of them who were soft supporters or giving him leeway might change their minds fairly quickly. So I think you have to be careful of that. My circle of friends here, I think, is a little bit distorted because this is like the capital of federal bureaucracy. So people's lives are more affected here by things like DOJ cuts than they are in other places.
Yeah.
But I think in general, the economy, not necessarily the government cuts, are where moms are going to get off the train quickly if things don't turn around. But I think we've seen some fairly decent, promising numbers on inflation in the past month. So I think the American people judge less quickly than the media in Washington, D.C. does. Yeah.
You mentioned that about D.C. I talked to a friend who went to a playground on Capitol Hill where they live, and 3 of the parents that usually meet up and the kids all play, 3 of those parents had lost their jobs. And so there are people who are obviously being affected in lots of ways. People in the private sector are also facing layoffs. I did a little check last week. Many private businesses are also figuring out a way to streamline, make things better. And
yes.
I think all of this stuff is not necessarily done perfectly. And there are some things you think, well, why'd you fire everybody first and then have to hire them back? But not everybody, of course, it's with some. But then
a few, right.
Now a judge is involved, and that all gets very, very messy. And I think it's going to come down to Congress making some decisions about how much money to allow to be spent in the country. And that is part of the spending bill. I did want to just touch on this, that last week you had Chuck Schumer and the 9 other Democrats vote with Republicans to keep the government funded. So there was not a government shutdown. I thought that was the right decision by Chuck Schumer. The wrong decision by Chuck Schumer was giving any credence to the lie that the Democrats were ever going to have power to do something instead of doing this very same thing. So now you have a situation where Chuck Schumer is now public enemy number 1 by all the Democrats. And he has a book on anti-Semitism that's supposed to come out tomorrow. And they just canceled that entire book tour because he doesn't want to deal with the protests. And the protests are not coming from Republicans. They're coming from the far left. So they're in a real fix.
No, Schumer overpromised and underdelivered on the amount of resistance he was going to be able to give. Because for Democrats, it doesn't make sense to shut down the government. They would certainly be blamed, at least in part. It wouldn't go well for them. And their central argument against Trump is that every single bit of the federal government is sacrosanct and useful to the people of America. And therefore, shutting it down and supporting that would be counter to everything they're selling people on. But I understand, because Republicans have been in this position before, that the base has an emotional need for him to do something. And often the something isn't gonna work politically for normal people, but they insist upon it nonetheless. So he sort of evaded that trap, but now he's got his own personal trap, which is that he can't go out and give events right now. And by the way, on the cutting of federal bureaucracies, I want to be clear, like, I'm not unsympathetic to those whose lives are disrupted, because I know a lot of them here. Although there's just as many who you'll see at the playground or the midday workout who say, ugh, they're making me go back to the office and actually work, so I won't be able to do this in the middle of the day anymore. And it's like, a lot of people have been working that way for a long time.
Yeah.
And a lot of Americans are learning that federal bureaucracies have different ways of doing things and more protections and less work than they have to do on a regular basis, with basically no threat of ever losing any benefit ever. And that makes them less sympathetic than Democrats think they are.
You know, we are right now 5 years since the government shut down America and a lot of the world because of the COVID pandemic. And I'm like a lot of people, I believe, I don't really love to revisit COVID.
Yeah.
There was this huge, long retrospective in the New York Times over the weekend. And I typically love to read historical fiction. And I remember when COVID happened, I wanted to go back and read books that were written in the time frame of like the Spanish flu, for example.
Right.
And what was interesting is that there were hardly any. There's hardly anything. And then I looked into that, and there were literature, I guess, historians of literature, not historical fiction, but historians who look at literature. And they said that what happens in pandemics is that nobody wants to talk about it again. Mm-hmm. They just want to move on. So I'm kind of like that. But the effects and the consequences of what happened 5 years ago are still being felt today by businesses, by empty storefronts, by a lack of trust in government, by the horrendous education test scores, the learning scores that have gone way down, even behavior, for example, the loneliness pandemic, people staying home. Like, actually, the consequences are quite great, and it's worth revisiting. Yeah. And I thought I would just touch base with you because I saw a couple of posts that you had over the weekend, as this was something especially that affected you very strongly with a mother of young children.
Yeah, this is something I talk about a lot because I have the tendency you have, which is like, I just want to kind of like breeze past this.
Right, yeah.
And also, we must stay mad, bro. Like, we got to stay mad because that's how you get political accountability. And so many of the people who made these terrible decisions still have power and are happy to say they would do it again, by the way. Pringle.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, so is her first name Betsy Pringle, I think?
Yes.
Who's head of, or Becky Pringle, who's head of the National Education Association, one of the major teachers unions. She told the New York Times this week on school closures, the most obviously damaging thing they did. Just like, we have all the receipts. She said, no, we were right to listen to the infectious disease guys, and a really cautious approach was the correct one. And when you have people still rationalizing that one and still telling you openly that that's how they would do business again, we are in danger still. We are in danger of this kind of thing. And when you look back, I have to look back to remind myself, I was reading a book by a Virginia legislator, Chap Peterson, a Democrat who stood up against his own party in Virginia to say, like, we shouldn't be shutting things down. What are we doing? You realize, like, the original order from the governor in Virginia was stay in your home outside of necessary business. What kind of directive is that for a free people? In California, it was worse. It was just stay in your home was the directive. And the party that, like, did most of that told you in 2024 that they were running as a freedom ticket. This is a freedom ticket. It was the widest spread deprivation of basic civil liberties in our lifetimes. And they happily played along with it. And what worries me is that they still say, some of them, they'd do it again.
They also, in this New York Times columnist piece, said, well, I guess maybe we should have maybe looked into the lab leak theory a little bit more instead of just dismissing it out of hand. And Mark Thiessen was on America's Newsroom, and he believes that one of the reasons that they did not focus on the lab leak is that they think it would have helped Trump in the election of 2020.
I mean, a bunch of people, allegedly smart ones, whose job it is to tell the difference between true and false, convinced themselves that this thing they were kind of making up, that the lab leak theory had no credence when it clearly had credence and a lot of people knew it did. They convinced themselves that that was a noble lie and that it was right to fool the American people and the people of the world about the origins of this disease because they didn't like that the people they didn't like might think bad thoughts that they didn't approve. They did the same thing on schools, on masks. These were all noble lies that they convinced themselves would be a great idea. But there aren't noble lies. That's the truth.
The one that really gets to me is that finding out that the whole 6 feet distance thing was just arbitrarily made up. It's like the guy, you know how people think they need to get 10,000 steps a day?
Yeah.
But then you look back and it was just some guy in marketing who was like, 10,000, yeah, that sounds good. Okay, and there's no scientific basis to it. The 6 feet distance, there was no scientific basis to that either. Do you think we as a nation need to have some sort of a drive to help those COVID kids that are so far behind in reading and math? Should there be something, or do we just let it go and hope for the best?
It's hard. It's a hard problem to solve. I think you have instances where intensive tutoring has helped. You have some indication in places like Louisiana and Mississippi that instituting basic phonics, a better reading curriculum than the one we have that got kind of trendy a couple decades ago and has not worked out for children, that going back to basic phonics and a really good learning to read curriculum in places like Louisiana especially show that you can overcome losses from the past and grow. Because once children learn to read, they then read to learn. So you've put them on a better path. And there are places that show progress almost in spite of all of these mistakes made over the past 5 years. And so I think look to those who have put in those curriculums, who have done the work and who have made it possible for children of every level to succeed. Because what was so tragic about the closings and what we said at the time, those of us who fought against it, was you're obviously hurting the least among us the most because they do not have resources at home to counteract what you've taken away from them.
Well, those were the essential workers.
Yeah.
They had to go to work. So I'd love to ask what I might be missing, what you're paying attention to.
What am I paying attention to? I think the combination, just because we've just been talking about this, the combination of the disillusionment of the pandemic and the lack of public trust, sort of coming up at this 5-year anniversary point, at an inflection point for Trump in his presidency where people are trying to see like, oh, is this working out for me or it's not? I think the Democrats, media, elite circles, persistent inability to understand how deep their public trust problem is what is going to bode well for Trump moving forward. Because if you still don't understand at this point how you got him as president of the United States for the second time, I don't know how you course correct to fight against him. And he's an incredibly difficult figure to figure out how to fight against. We've learned this over these many years. So I think I've been surprised because I think he does face peril when it comes to something like tariffs and whether those affect people in negative ways. Because it can hike prices. It can cause chaos. It can make businesses contract, right? I think he faces peril. But as usual, his opponents seem to end up facing more peril because they are unwilling to deal with him as the duly elected president of the United States of America.
Yeah, I say that he is blessed with the worst opposition.
He truly
or maybe
is.
the best opposition, if it was. But they are.
But I think we're at that inflection point right now where I'm going, are you guys really still doing the same thing?
They are, and it is stunning. I don't know. I maintain that the Democrat that emerges to be a leader of the party will be one that fully disowns the Bidens and the cover-up.
Yes.
And I think only once you do that can you move on. It's sort of like what you're saying in terms of taking responsibility. Or I just can't believe there's no Democrat that's mad that they were lied to, that he was in perfect shape to do the next 4 years, and they were asked to campaign, to donate, to not do a primary, to tell their constituents that, yes, absolutely, you should vote for them. And nobody's mad? That surprises me.
Maybe Dean Phillips? Is Dean Phillips still mad?
I just had him on America's Newsroom, and he is he's a nice guy. And he
I need him
kind
to
of
be
does it, but
madder.
he's so nice. It's like, I don't think that's going to work either.
Yeah.
No more
He's got to be
Mr. Nice
madder.
Guy.
He's got to stay mad, bro. He's got to stay mad.
I love it. This is the headline. Stay mad, bro and sis. Great to have you. Thank you so much, Mary
Thank you very
Katharine
much.
Ham.